You're in your kitchen, just finishing dinner prep, thinking it's an ordinary evening, and suddenly your world explodes in the form of boiling hot soup in your face. That's exactly what happened to me. My son's mother-in-law, yes, the woman I had welcomed into our home, decided to cross every boundary imaginable. And in that moment, I felt shock, anger, humiliation, all mixed together. But what she didn't know is that I had one weapon she couldn't touch: my voice, my resolve, and one phone call that would turn the tables completely. Today, I'm going to take you through that story, the betrayal, the confrontation, and the empowerment that followed. By the end, you'll see how sometimes the greatest power we have isn't in retaliation, it's in standing firm and speaking up. The evening had started like any other ordinary night in our home. The sun had dipped below the horizon and the house was filled with the quiet hum of appliances, the soft ticking of the clock, and the faint smell of herbs and spices I had used for dinner. I was chopping vegetables, humming to myself, lost in the rhythm of simple domestic bliss, thinking about how lucky I was to have a family around me and a roof over my head. And yet even in that simple moment I did not know that my world was about to explode with an unexpected act of cruelty that would change the air in the house forever. I heard voices raised from the dining room, but at first I ignored them because disagreements happen all the time in families and I assumed it was a minor quarrel that would resolve itself. But then I noticed the sharp edge in the tone, the kind of sharpness that makes your stomach twist and your body tense, and before I could even process the sound I felt the scorching heat across my face and chest, and it was soup, hot soup, the kind that could burn through not just the skin but the soul, and I staggered back, almost dropping the knife in my hand, and the smell of it, the rich savory aroma that I had been preparing, suddenly turned into a weapon aimed at me, and my eyes watered and my skin burned and my heart raced as shock and disbelief collided in a way I had never experienced before. I instinctively raised my hands to my face, trying to shield it as I stumbled backward, and my legs felt like lead, as though the floor beneath me had vanished. And yet in the midst of that pain and confusion there was a split second when my mind froze and registered the impossible truth that the person who had thrown it was not an enemy, a stranger, or a thief, but someone I had allowed into my home, someone I had welcomed, someone I had treated with kindness and respect and thought of as family. And in that instant, betrayal and anger and pain all collided into one force that left me standing trembling, trying to comprehend what had just happened. And yet even in that moment of chaos I caught sight of her expression, the woman I had called my son's mother-in-law, her eyes wide and furious, her hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline of her own actions, and I realized that she had crossed a line, not just into violence but into a space that could not be erased by apologies or explanations. I could feel my skin stinging as I wiped it with a cloth, and the physical pain was almost secondary to the humiliation and disbelief that washed over me as I thought about the audacity it took for someone to think that such behavior could ever be acceptable in a family home, a place meant for safety, comfort, and trust. And I realized in that moment that boundaries I had assumed were understood were completely ignored, and that I was standing in the aftermath of a deliberate act meant to assert power, control, and intimidation. And even though I was shaken and my body burned with the heat of the soup, I also recognize the importance of staying grounded, because in moments like these, if you let fear or anger dictate your next move, you lose the narrative, you lose your power, and you lose yourself. I took a slow breath, trying to steady my trembling hands and focus on the room around me, because clarity in chaos is a rare gift and I needed every ounce of it. I needed to understand the dynamics at play, the possible motives, the emotions driving her to this act, and the way forward that would ensure my safety and dignity. And I remember thinking to myself, this is the moment where your character shows, not in your anger but in your composure. And I reminded myself that I could not allow shock to paralyze me, I could not allow humiliation to make me small. I had to rise above the flames, both literal and metaphorical, that had been thrown my way, and decide in a split second how I would respond. And in that pause, as I looked at her standing there breathing heavily and glaring with a mix of triumph and rage, I felt the surge of old lessons I had learned from life, the lessons of patience, restraint, and inner strength, the lessons that Auntie May had always whispered about, the power of calm when others tried to provoke the storm. And I knew that even though the burn on my skin hurt, even though the surprise attack had left my chest tight and my vision slightly blurred, I could still choose my next move, I could still reclaim control of the moment, and I could still set boundaries that would be respected whether she liked it or not. And in that realization I felt a flicker of power rise inside me, because chaos can never touch the person who refuses to let it. I also thought about my son and my family and the message that such behavior would send if left unchecked, and I realized that if I reacted with uncontrolled anger or hysteria I would be giving her the very victory she sought, the very power she craved, the sense of control that comes from making someone else fear and flinch, and I was not going to give that to her, not even in the face of scorching soup and humiliation, not even in the middle of an attack that could have easily turned into something far worse. And so I squared my shoulders, took another breath, and focused on what needed to be done. I focused on the facts, the visible evidence, the physical pain and the emotional shock, and I reminded myself that a measured response now could prevent escalation later, and that power is most potent when it is calm, deliberate and unwavering. As I finally moved forward to address her, voice steady and eyes locked on hers, I realized that in that moment I was no longer just reacting to an act of violence. I was asserting my identity, my authority, my right to be treated with respect in my own home, and I spoke clearly, asking her to explain herself, asking her to recognize the absurdity and cruelty of what she had done. And even though she tried to deflect, even though she tried to justify, even though she seemed to revel in the chaos she had caused, I maintained control of my voice, of my posture, of my presence, because I understood that composure is contagious, and that when you hold your ground others are forced to respond rather than dictate the rhythm of the encounter. I also took note of the environment, the kitchen, the table, the chairs, the walls. All of it had witnessed an act that should never have occurred, and I realized that my home was not just a physical space, it was a reflection of my values, and letting this stand unchallenged would have been a betrayal to myself and to the family I cared for. And I knew that while the sting of the soup would fade and the redness on my skin would heal, the memory of this incident could become a turning point or a scar, and I chose to make it a turning point, a moment where I demonstrated that respect is non-negotiable and that violence, intimidation and cruelty have no place in a home built on love, trust and family bonds. And even as my heart raced and my muscles tensed, I began thinking about the steps I would take next, how I would protect myself, how I would ensure that boundaries were understood, how I would communicate the seriousness of her actions not just to her but to everyone in the family, so that no one could ever assume such behavior would be tolerated again. And in that planning I felt my fear transform into strategy, my anger transform into clarity, my pain transform into resolve, and I realized that while the moment had been shocking and hurtful, it was also empowering, because it reminded me of my strength, my dignity, my ability to face adversity without losing my center. As I wiped the last traces of soup from my face and steadied my shaking hands and prepared to speak, I remembered that courage is not the absence of fear but the decision to act despite it, and in that moment I embodied that courage and knew that whatever came next, my actions would be deliberate, not reactive, calm, not frantic, measured, not chaotic, and that the lesson of that night was not the attack itself but the power I found within myself in the aftermath of it, and that for the first time in the midst of humiliation and pain I saw clearly that I was more than capable of handling even the most shocking acts with poise, strength and authority. After the initial shock of having hot soup thrown in my face began to settle, I realized that the most important thing in that moment was not reacting with anger or panic but finding my center and reclaiming control over a situation that could have easily spiraled into chaos, because when someone crosses boundaries the first instinct is often to fight back or to yell or to let the emotions take over, but Auntie May always said that the true power in any conflict comes from calm clarity and measured action, and I knew that if I allowed myself to lose control in that kitchen that night I would give her the victory she was craving, and I refused to do that. I took a deep breath and felt the sting of the soup on my skin, the lingering warmth on my cheeks and chest, and even though my body trembled with the mix of physical pain, humiliation and adrenaline, I reminded myself that I could choose how to respond, and that my response would define not only the rest of the evening but also how she and everyone around me would perceive my authority in my own home. I wiped the remaining soup from my face with a cloth, slowly, deliberately, as if every movement was a statement of control and composure, and I looked at her eyes, meeting them directly without flinching, even though every fiber of my being screamed to turn away and shout and retaliate, and I asked her calmly, not accusingly but with absolute firmness, why she thought such an act was acceptable and what purpose it served, because the truth is, when you face someone who has crossed a line, their shock often mirrors your calm and the power shifts to the person who can maintain clarity in the midst of chaos. I watched her hesitate, shifting her weight from one foot to the other, realizing that her attack had not had the effect she imagined, and that for the first time she was confronted not with fear but with unwavering resolve, and that moment of hesitation gave me space to assert control over the narrative and to set the tone for everything that would follow that night. I also understood that anger expressed too early can cloud judgment and escalate conflict, so I focused instead on breathing and speaking slowly, each word carefully chosen to convey authority without aggression, and as I spoke I noticed the subtle changes in her expression, the flicker of uncertainty, the slight downturn of her mouth, the narrowing of her eyes as she realized that the person she thought she could intimidate was standing firm, and that realization strengthened my resolve and reminded me that calm confidence often terrifies those who rely on chaos to feel powerful. I made it clear without raising my voice that her behavior was unacceptable, that it crossed every boundary imaginable, and that there would be consequences if she believed she could repeat such an act, because boundaries are only meaningful when they are enforced consistently and clearly, and I wanted her to understand that my home was a space of respect and safety, not a place where anyone could act with impunity. In the minutes that followed, I noticed that maintaining my composure also helped me think strategically about next steps and the larger dynamics at play, because an attack like this is rarely an isolated incident. It is usually fueled by underlying emotions and tensions, and by keeping calm I was able to assess her motivations, the risks to myself, my family, and my relationship with my son and his wife, and to formulate a plan that ensured both immediate safety and long-term clarity and accountability. And I realized that responding with measured authority would not only address the immediate situation but also prevent future attempts at intimidation, because people respect firmness even more than they fear punishment. I continued speaking slowly with a steady tone, emphasizing the seriousness of her actions and the expectations for future interactions, and in doing so I felt a transformation inside myself, a shift from shock and fear to empowerment and clarity, and that transformation reminded me that often the way we handle conflict says more about who we are than the conflict itself, because by refusing to let anger and panic dictate my actions I was demonstrating my values, my strength, and my ability to protect both myself and those I care about without descending into the chaos that she had created. I also realized that in that moment I was setting an example for my son and his wife, showing them that respect is non-negotiable and that standing firm is not cruelty but a necessary act of self-preservation and empowerment. As she stammered, trying to justify herself, I did not allow interruptions, I did not allow excuses, I simply maintained eye contact and reiterated the seriousness of the offense, and reminded her that in my home all family members are expected to act with respect and consideration, and that any actions intended to intimidate, humiliate, or harm would not be tolerated, and that calm repetition reinforced the boundaries in a way that anger never could. And it slowly began to sink in that her attack had failed to achieve its intended goal, and that the real power in the room now rested with me, because I had chosen composure over chaos, clarity over confusion, and authority over impulsive retaliation. I also reflected on the importance of voice and presence, because the way you carry yourself communicates far more than words alone, and by standing tall, speaking slowly, and holding my gaze, I was sending a signal that the lines of respect had been drawn, and that my authority would not be questioned, and that the consequences of crossing those lines would be felt whether or not I needed to shout or punish, because confidence and calm are inherently intimidating to someone who thrives on disruption and chaos, and that realization reinforced my belief in the power of measured response. Throughout the encounter I reminded myself that control is not about domination, it is about clarity, it is about asserting boundaries, it is about refusing to be diminished by another person's aggression, and as I held my ground I felt my fear and anger transform into determination and clarity, and I understood that the real confrontation was not with her, it was with the space she had invaded, the disrespect she had attempted to impose, and the threat she represented to the order and safety of my home. And by addressing it calmly, deliberately, and authoritatively, I was reclaiming that space and reinforcing the values that mattered most to me and to my family. As the minutes passed, she began to realize that her intended intimidation had failed, and that the calm authority I projected was impenetrable by her chaos, and I could see the subtle shifts in her posture, the small signs of uncertainty, the slight softening of her stance, as if the realization that she could not control me had finally begun to sink in, and that sight gave me both satisfaction and clarity. That calm, deliberate response is far more powerful than rage, because it leaves the other person to confront the reality of their actions without the distraction of your emotional reaction, and that is when the power truly shifts. By the end of the encounter I had established clear expectations, immediate boundaries, and a sense of authority that could not be challenged without consequence, and I knew that I had turned a moment of shocking aggression into a demonstration of inner strength, calm power, and deliberate action, and that while the soup had left a mark on my skin, my response left a mark on the environment, the dynamics of the family, and the perception of everyone involved, and that realization filled me with confidence that no matter what came next I had handled the situation with dignity, clarity, and effectiveness, and that nothing she could do would ever undermine the authority and presence I had reclaimed in my own home. After the initial confrontation and the shock of the soup attack had subsided, I realized that simply responding with calm authority was not enough, because in order to truly regain control I needed to understand the root cause of her behavior. I needed to peel back the layers of anger, entitlement and resentment that had driven someone I had considered family to commit such a reckless act, and so I began observing her interactions with the rest of the family, noticing the subtle ways she tried to assert dominance or provoke reactions, the quiet comments meant to undermine my authority, the thinly veiled criticisms at my son or his wife, the small manipulations intended to disrupt harmony. And I understood that this act of throwing hot soup was not random. It was a culmination of smaller behaviors that had been building over time, behaviors that were fueled by jealousy, insecurity, a sense of superiority, and the need to control the environment around her. And by identifying the root cause, I began to see a pattern, a map that would guide how I responded next and protect myself from future attacks. I also spoke with my son and gently probed for context, not to shame him or to attack him, but to understand the dynamics between his wife and his mother, because family conflicts are rarely one-sided, and understanding the relationships involved gave me insight into why she may have felt emboldened to act in such a dramatic and dangerous way. And I realized that her sense of entitlement and her perception of her role in our family had been reinforced over years of unchallenged behavior, small acts of disrespect, ignored comments that went unaddressed, and boundaries that were never enforced, and that in this moment of extreme escalation she felt confident enough to act because she assumed the consequences would be minimal, or that the chaos would allow her to control the narrative. And I understood that by identifying this pattern I could address not just the immediate incident but the deeper issues that had created the conditions for it to occur. I reflected on my own responses and recognized that while calm authority had diffused the immediate chaos, it was understanding the why that would allow me to prevent recurrence, and that this required empathy not for the attack itself but for the psychological and emotional drivers behind it. And I reminded myself that recognizing motives does not mean excusing behavior. It means arming oneself with knowledge and strategy to maintain safety, respect and authority in all future interactions. And in that realization I felt a sense of empowerment, because clarity brings confidence and confidence transforms fear into decisive action. I also began to consider the impact of generational dynamics and cultural expectations, because sometimes behaviors like this are rooted in long-held beliefs about hierarchy, respect and entitlement within families. And by understanding how she viewed her role in our home and how she had learned to assert herself, I could anticipate future moves, manage interactions more effectively and protect my own family from further disruptions. And I realized that this insight was more valuable than any emotional reaction, because it allowed me to operate from a position of knowledge rather than emotion, and that knowledge would guide my decisions and set the tone for all future boundaries. In addition to observing and reflecting, I started documenting interactions, noting patterns of behavior, instances where boundaries had been tested, comments that had crossed the line and moments that had caused tension. And I realized that having a clear record of events was critical, not only for my own clarity but also to communicate effectively with my son, his wife and any other family members who might be involved. And by maintaining detailed observations I could approach discussions with facts rather than emotions, and that approach ensures that authority and respect are communicated clearly and cannot be dismissed as overreaction or paranoia. And in that documentation I found further evidence of the underlying drivers of her behavior. I also spoke with trusted friends and mentors who had experienced similar dynamics and gathered their perspectives on how to handle someone who acts out of a combination of entitlement, control and insecurity. And I realized that the behaviors I had witnessed were not unique. They were common among people who feel threatened by shifts in family dynamics or who perceive a loss of influence. And by learning from the experiences of others I was able to formulate strategies for setting firm boundaries, de-escalating potential confrontations and asserting authority in ways that would prevent future aggression and maintain the dignity of everyone involved. And that strategy gave me a sense of preparation and foresight that reduced my fear and increased my confidence. As I continued to reflect, I also considered the psychological impact on my own family, including my son, who may have felt torn between loyalty to his mother and respect for his home and wife. And I realized that addressing the root cause was not only about managing the attacker but also about ensuring that my son and his wife understood the dynamics and were equipped to respond with confidence and assertiveness. And I had conversations with them explaining the motivations I had identified, the patterns of behavior and the strategies we would use collectively to maintain respect, harmony and safety. And in those conversations I could see the relief and empowerment that knowledge brought them, reinforcing the importance of understanding the why as much as the what. I also took the time to reflect on my own feelings and reactions, acknowledging the mix of anger, betrayal, shock and sadness that had arisen, and I understood that processing these emotions was critical because unresolved feelings can cloud judgment and weaken the clarity that is necessary when addressing someone who has already demonstrated a willingness to cross boundaries. And by sitting with my emotions and allowing myself to fully understand them, I strengthened my resolve and enhanced my ability to act with calm authority, because emotional clarity and strategic thinking go hand in hand when facing someone who attempts to manipulate or intimidate through aggression. In addition to reflection, I prepared mentally for future interactions, imagining scenarios where she might test boundaries again or attempt to provoke reactions, and I rehearsed calm responses, clear statements and assertive but non-aggressive communication. And I realized that preparation is a form of power because it allows you to maintain control even when confronted with unexpected aggression, and that by envisioning responses in advance I reduced the risk of being caught off guard and strengthened my ability to respond with authority and confidence, and that foresight gave me peace even in the aftermath of such a shocking incident. Finally, I considered the broader implications of her behavior, understanding that her actions could affect family gatherings, relationships, and the overall atmosphere of our home, and I committed to a plan of consistent enforcement of boundaries, clear communication, and strategic observation so that respect would be maintained and that no one in the family would be allowed to feel unsafe or disrespected. And in that commitment I found a sense of empowerment that transformed what had been a moment of chaos and humiliation into a foundation for lasting authority, strength, and clarity. And I knew that by understanding the root cause I had not only addressed the immediate threat but also created a framework for protecting my family and myself in the future. After I had spent time processing the initial shock and understanding the root cause of her behavior, I realized that knowledge alone was not enough, because the moment called for decisive action, a move that would change the trajectory of the conflict and demonstrate that boundaries were not only understood but enforceable. And that action came in the form of a single phone call, a call that would shift the balance of power and demand accountability and clarity. And I remember holding the phone in my hand, feeling the weight of what was about to happen, because one call can be the difference between chaos continuing unchecked and authority being restored. And I understood that in that moment courage was not about yelling or retaliation, it was about clarity, control, and speaking truth with calm authority. I took a deep breath and reminded myself of everything I had learned about staying composed even under pressure, about projecting strength through measured words, about ensuring that my message would land without escalation. And I knew that this call had to be deliberate, focused, and unshakable, because it was not just about addressing the act of the soup but about setting a precedent for how respect and behavior would be managed moving forward. And as I dialed the number, my heart pounded but my voice remained steady, because power comes from clarity, not panic, and from action, not hesitation. And I was ready to reclaim the narrative. The person on the other end answered, and I began speaking with calm but firm authority, explaining the incident without embellishment, without anger, without begging for validation, just stating the facts clearly and precisely. And I could hear the intake of breath on the other end as they registered the seriousness of what had occurred, and that sound alone reminded me that words have power when delivered with conviction, because people who have underestimated consequences suddenly realize the gravity of their actions when confronted by clarity and composure. And that realization shifted the room, the house, and the family dynamic. Even though I was miles away physically, the authority in my voice sent ripples that could not be ignored. I explained exactly what had happened, the act of throwing hot soup, the physical harm, the emotional impact, and the disruption to the household, and I emphasized that such behavior was unacceptable, that it violated trust and respect, and that it would not be tolerated under any circumstances. And as I spoke, I could feel a transformation within myself, a sense of power reclaiming territory that had been challenged, a sense of control returning to a situation that had felt chaotic and dangerous. And I realized that sometimes the most powerful response is not a confrontation in person but a deliberate, clear assertion of authority through one unshakable voice. I also laid out the consequences calmly, without threats, without anger, just a clear articulation of the expectations moving forward, the boundaries that must be honored, the respect that must be maintained, and the accountability that would follow if those expectations were ignored, because people who cross lines often do so believing there will be no repercussions. And by outlining them clearly in a single focused moment, I removed ambiguity and forced responsibility onto the person whose actions had caused the disruption. And that clarity itself was a form of power, because it left no room for misinterpretation or excuse. I could feel the tension on the line as my words sank in because authority delivered with calm precision has a way of silencing even the most defiant individuals, and I did not rush, I did not raise my voice, I did not resort to dramatics, I simply stated the truth and the expectations and allowed the silence to speak as loudly as my words, and in that silence I could sense the recognition of boundaries, the acknowledgement of responsibility, the understanding that the dynamics had shifted and that from this point forward there would be no tolerance for acts of aggression or intimidation, and that realization reinforced my own sense of power and effectiveness. During the call I also emphasized the importance of preserving the dignity of the household and of the family members involved, explaining that respect for all parties was non-negotiable and that any further attempts to assert control through aggression would be met with immediate intervention and consequences, and by framing the conversation around respect, dignity and accountability I shifted the focus from punishment to restoration of order and harmony, and that approach resonated more deeply than anger ever could because people respond more effectively to clear expectations than to emotional outbursts, and by doing so I ensured that the house would remain a space of safety and authority. As I spoke I also felt a sense of empowerment because this was a moment where I had transformed shock into action, fear into strategy, and humiliation into authority, and I knew that the ripple effect of this call would extend beyond the immediate situation because it would influence future behavior, interactions, and the perception of my presence within the family. And I realized that sometimes the most powerful moments in life are those when you act decisively with clarity and let the natural consequences of authority enforce themselves without further drama, because strength is demonstrated not in reaction but in deliberate control. After delivering the message and clearly outlining the expectations, I paused to allow the other person to respond and listened carefully to their words, tone and hesitation, because understanding the reaction is just as important as asserting authority, and I noted the subtle cues of acknowledgement, acceptance and even quiet apprehension, because those signals indicated that the message had landed and that the power dynamic had shifted permanently in my favor, and that awareness gave me the confidence to end the call knowing that I had asserted control without needing to escalate into confrontation or conflict, and that is a lesson that will remain with me forever. I also reflected on the symbolism of that single call, realizing that one phone call could redirect the trajectory of chaos, restore boundaries, reinforce respect, and demonstrate unwavering authority. And I internalized the truth that preparation, clarity, and courage in moments of crisis allow a person to transform vulnerability into empowerment, and that even in situations that feel physically and emotionally overwhelming, there is always a path to reclaiming control if one acts with deliberation and calm conviction. And that awareness strengthened my sense of self and fortified my confidence in managing conflict and setting standards. Following the call I felt a sense of relief, not because the problem was solved entirely but because the first step in reclaiming authority had been taken, and I knew that the remaining work would involve consistent enforcement of boundaries, communication of expectations, and vigilance in observing behavior. But the foundation had been laid, and that foundation was built on calm authority, clear communication, and strategic action, and I realized that the impact of that moment would resonate in all future family interactions because it had demonstrated that aggression would not be rewarded and that authority would be exercised deliberately and consistently, and that understanding gave me peace even as I continued to navigate the aftermath of the attack. I also took a moment to reflect on the power of my own voice, the ability to speak clearly, firmly, and calmly under pressure, and the way that voice alone can alter behavior and command respect. And I realized that empowerment is not about physical confrontation or dominance, it is about clarity of purpose, courage in the face of fear, and the strategic use of communication to establish boundaries and ensure accountability. And that realization transformed what could have been a moment of victimhood into an opportunity to assert dignity, authority, and control, and it reinforced my belief in the value of preparation, reflection, and courage in the most challenging circumstances. By the end of the call I felt a renewed sense of empowerment because I had taken control of a situation that had initially left me shocked, humiliated, and physically pained, and had transformed it into an opportunity to assert boundaries, demand respect, and communicate authority clearly and decisively. And I knew that the effects of this call would ripple throughout the family, reinforcing the lessons of respect, accountability, and clear communication for everyone involved. And I recognized that true power lies not in reacting emotionally to aggression but in acting strategically with calm, courage, and deliberate authority, and that understanding would guide every decision I made moving forward. After I made that one decisive call and felt the immediate shift in authority, I knew that the work was far from over, because while a single act of assertiveness could change the immediate dynamics, it could not by itself rebuild respect, restore order, or reinforce boundaries over time. And I realized that the next step was the ongoing process of ensuring that everyone understood the rules of engagement in my home, that respect would be maintained, and that no one would ever again believe that aggression, intimidation, or cruelty could go unchecked. And I knew this was a test of consistency, vigilance, and strategic follow-through, because authority is only meaningful when it is enforced and maintained, and I was determined to enforce it without exception. I began by addressing my son and his wife directly, explaining the importance of standing together in the aftermath of what had occurred and making it clear that the household operated on principles of respect, safety, and accountability, and that anyone who tried to undermine that framework would face immediate consequences. And I emphasized that boundaries were not just a suggestion or a preference, but a requirement for harmonious living, and that everyone needed to internalize that truth to prevent future conflicts and misunderstandings. And that conversation also served to reinforce their confidence in my authority, because by clearly articulating the rules I demonstrated both leadership and protection, and they began to understand the importance of unity and vigilance. Next, I worked on establishing physical and psychological boundaries within the home by reorganizing spaces where interactions could be monitored more easily, creating areas that were off limits to anyone who had previously demonstrated aggression, and making it clear through repeated conversation and subtle reinforcement that certain behaviors would no longer be tolerated, and that any breach of these boundaries would be met with immediate response. And by doing so, I created a structure that communicated authority without constant confrontation, because consistency is what transforms rules from words into lived reality. And when people recognize that limits are enforced without exception, they are far less likely to test them again. And I realized that this structural approach was essential for long-term stability and respect. I also implemented clear protocols for communication so that any concerns, complaints, or conflicts could be addressed promptly and in a structured manner rather than through impulsive reactions or emotional outbursts. And I reinforced the principle that respectful dialogue was required at all times, and that escalation through anger or aggression would no longer be permitted. And I modeled this behavior consistently by addressing my own concerns calmly, clearly, and deliberately, and by doing so I provided a blueprint for everyone in the family to follow, and demonstrated that authority is as much about communication as it is about enforcement, and that clarity and consistency together create a framework for lasting respect. At the same time, I focused on cultivating a sense of accountability in the family, because respect and authority are meaningless if they are not tied to responsibility. And I emphasized that everyone, including my son and his wife, had a role in maintaining the boundaries and values of the household, and that protecting the integrity of our home was a shared responsibility. And I worked with them to identify strategies for responding to provocations, maintaining composure, and reinforcing expectations consistently. And in that process, I saw them grow in confidence and awareness, and I realized that empowering others to uphold standards strengthens authority and creates a culture of mutual respect and vigilance that cannot be easily undermined. I also took care to monitor the former aggressor's behavior closely, observing interactions, noting any signs of testing boundaries or attempts to manipulate or intimidate, and I responded immediately with calm but firm intervention whenever necessary, reinforcing the lessons from the call and the expectations that had been communicated. And I realized that early intervention is critical, because allowing even minor infractions to go unchallenged signals weakness and encourages escalation, and that by being vigilant and consistent I was sending a clear message that the boundaries I had set were not negotiable, and that respect was mandatory. And that realization reinforced both my confidence and my control over the household dynamics. In addition, I focused on teaching and modeling emotional regulation and self-control, because one of the most powerful tools in maintaining authority is demonstrating calm under pressure. And by showing that my decisions were deliberate and measured rather than impulsive or emotional, I reinforced my credibility and demonstrated that true power does not need to escalate into aggression to be effective. And I encouraged my son and his wife to adopt similar strategies to maintain their own composure and authority in the face of provocation, and in doing so I created a ripple effect that strengthened the resilience and confidence of the entire family unit. I also spent time reflecting on the importance of follow-through because setting expectations is meaningless without enforcement, and I committed to addressing every breach of respect promptly, consistently, and without hesitation, and I realized that the pattern of enforcement communicates more strongly than a single confrontation because it establishes a clear cause and effect understanding for everyone in the family and reinforces the seriousness of boundaries and expectations, and by maintaining vigilance and consistency I could ensure that the lessons from the initial incident were not forgotten and that respect and accountability became the norm rather than the exception. Another key aspect was the creation of a support system within the family to ensure that no one felt isolated or vulnerable to manipulation or intimidation, and I encouraged open communication between family members, fostering trust, transparency, and shared responsibility, and I emphasized that protecting the integrity of the household was not the job of one person alone but a collective responsibility, and by empowering my son and his wife to assert boundaries and communicate expectations, I built a culture of mutual support that further strengthened respect and authority and diminished the likelihood of future conflicts escalating unchecked. I also took time to reflect personally on my own resilience and growth because the incident had been both physically and emotionally traumatic, and I realized that my ability to act decisively, calmly, and strategically was a direct result of self-awareness, preparation, and inner strength, and that cultivating these qualities over time would ensure that I could handle any future challenges with clarity and authority, and that the lesson for everyone watching was that self-empowerment is essential for maintaining boundaries and respect in any context, and that personal growth strengthens the family dynamic as a whole. Finally, I recognized that the ongoing process of boundary enforcement and respect cultivation would require patience, diligence, and consistency, and that while immediate authority can be asserted through decisive action, a lasting culture of respect and accountability is built over time through repeated reinforcement, clear communication, and strategic intervention, and I committed myself to this process, understanding that my role was to protect the household, maintain integrity, and model the principles of calm authority, consistency, and empowerment, and that by doing so I not only addressed the immediate threat but also established a foundation for long-term harmony and strength that would benefit my entire family and ensure that no one would ever again feel empowered to cross the lines of respect and safety that I had so deliberately and strategically established. After I had established clear boundaries, implemented consistent enforcement, and empowered my son and his wife to uphold the standards of our household, I realized that the final step in this journey was reflection and long-term strategy, because while immediate action and follow-up could address the acute incident, the real test of authority and personal strength comes in sustaining that control over time and in maintaining peace, dignity, and respect in the home while ensuring that no one could ever again cross the line, and I understood that this required patience, self-awareness, foresight, and a commitment to continuous vigilance and personal growth as well as family cohesion. I began by reflecting deeply on the incident itself, the shock, the pain, the humiliation, and the lessons that had emerged from the entire experience, and I recognized that while the moment of attack had been chaotic and emotionally charged, it had also revealed my capacity for resilience, calm, strategic thinking, and decisive action, and that awareness was empowering because it reinforced my understanding that strength is not measured by how little one feels fear or anger but by how effectively one can act despite it, and I committed myself to carrying that strength forward in all aspects of my life, because once you have seen what you are capable of under extreme pressure, there is no going back to passive acceptance or fear of confrontation. I also reflected on the growth of my family dynamic, recognizing that the incident had forced conversations that might not have happened otherwise about respect, accountability, boundaries, and shared responsibility, and that these conversations had strengthened trust, communication, and unity among the core family members, and I realized that moments of conflict, when managed thoughtfully, can catalyze long-term positive change because they expose vulnerabilities, create opportunities for learning, and provide the context for everyone involved to understand expectations clearly and internalize the importance of respect and cooperation, and that insight gave me confidence that the family unit was stronger than it had been before the attack because we had navigated a crisis together and emerged more cohesive and aware. At the same time, I devoted energy to planning for the future, anticipating potential flashpoints and scenarios where respect might be challenged or boundaries tested, and I rehearsed mentally how I would respond, maintaining calm, authority, clarity, and firmness in each imagined interaction, because preparation is a form of power and foresight allows one to act decisively without hesitation when confronted with unexpected provocation, and I understood that by envisioning these scenarios in advance I could reduce anxiety, uncertainty, and impulsive reactions, and instead respond with strategic precision, reinforcing the lessons learned and the authority established, and that planning strengthened my sense of control and ensured that no future incidents would catch me or my family off guard. I also considered the importance of personal reflection on my own emotional state, acknowledging the lingering feelings of anger, frustration, and even fear that naturally followed an incident of this magnitude, and recognizing that unprocessed emotions can cloud judgment, weaken authority, and impact future decision-making, and I took deliberate steps to process these feelings through journaling, contemplation, and conversations with trusted confidants and mentors, and I realized that acknowledging vulnerability while simultaneously committing to deliberate action is the cornerstone of sustained personal empowerment, because it transforms raw emotion into strategic clarity and prevents past trauma from undermining present strength. Another element of reflection involved examining the long-term lessons about human behavior and interpersonal dynamics, because understanding the motivations of someone who acts out of entitlement, aggression, or insecurity allows one to navigate future conflicts with insight and foresight, and I identified patterns that could predict potential aggression, manipulative tactics, or boundary testing, and used that knowledge to craft strategies for proactive management of interactions, ensuring that respect would be consistently upheld and that authority would remain unchallenged. And I realized that knowledge combined with vigilance is a far more powerful deterrent than anger or intimidation alone. I also devoted attention to cultivating my own resilience and mental fortitude, because the incident had highlighted the importance of inner strength in facing both immediate crises and ongoing challenges, and I developed routines and practices to reinforce calm, composure, and